Okay, I think we can probably get started now. Looks like we've leveled out a little bit on the participants. I'm sure we'll have some people trickle on in. Just by means of introduction, my name is Jacob Julian. I'm a senior sales engineer with Spectre Ops. Part of my role is that I get to work with people who are interested with our products and talk to them about how they can utilize it, demo the products, evaluate, and trial it. So today, I get to talk to you about BloodHound Enterprise and how you can use that in your organizations. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues who will be working the question and answer function of Zoom today. So if you do have questions as we go through, please don't feel like you have to wait until the end for them. We will do a Q&A at the end. However, please just feel free to use the Q&A function of Zoom, and they will respond directly to you in that function. So with that being said, I think let's get started here. And I'm just going to share a couple of slides here. We have quite a few people on the webinar today, and I know that people have varying levels of background and familiarity with BloodHound and with Spectre Ops as a whole. So I wanted to make sure that we're all really speaking with the same terminology and the same definitions, and talk to you a little bit about how we're approaching the problem of attack paths and attack path management in particular. And so just as a brief overview today, what are we going to be talking about? We'll be talking about what is an identity attack path specifically, and how do we approach that here at Spectre Ops. Talk a little bit about why you should care about that, but honestly, the fact that you're here on this webinar means that you care. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the impact of identity attack paths and where we've seen them being actively used. And then we'll talk about attack path management as a process and as a program. It's a somewhat new terminology, and we'll finish off with a demo of BloodHound Enterprise, which is where we'll actually be spending the bulk of the time today. For those of you who might be worried about time today, I don't believe that our demo will last the full hour. I would anticipate that the demo portion is done by the half hour or so, and then we'll use the rest of the time for live Q&A in addition to the Q&A that's happening during this webinar. So just to get started here, make sure we're all speaking about attack paths the same way. What is an identity attack path? Well, at its simplest, and our version of this is that attack paths are chains of abusable permissions and privileges, behaviors that can create links between computers and users and other objects in Active Directory and Azure. This can cause unnecessary privileges and undue distress for you, because in this case, as you can see, there is really no connection between the user on the left-hand side and the computer at the right-hand side, except between this indirect line of links that you see here. So really, when we talk about attack paths, this is what we're referring to is there's no direct connection. It is an indirect connection. I'll show you that in the product as well. Now, just because we're talking about attack paths today, in 2024 doesn't mean that these are something brand new. They've been used for quite a while in a number of different adversaries and tactics. Back in 2009, we referred to these as identity snowball attacks, right? I'd get access to one user, one computer, and I'd roll that into more, and I'd continue that process, growing my foothold exponentially. We also have the fairly well-known quote from John Lambert that defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs. And as long as that's true, attackers will win. So I think that one resonates pretty well with a lot of people when it comes to attack paths. But why should you care about attack paths? Well, there's a few reasons. They're a fairly powerful attack, and there are a couple of sub areas to that. I'd also like to add to this that an adversary doesn't need to burn an exploit or drop a malware payload onto your environment in order to take advantage of an attack path. They are leveraging the existing controls that are there. They're leveraging the existing permissions in many cases. And if a user is doing what they are allowed to do according to Active Directory, it's not going to raise many red flags to your SOC team. It's not going to send off SIM alerts and detection response alerts, because essentially the environment is functioning as intended. It is functioning as it's been built. So they are a very powerful version of an attack, and they are being actively used. Now, this is just a small example of some of the areas where we've seen identity attack paths being leveraged. Some of the more noteworthy ones or newsworthy ones, by no means is this all-inclusive. I would also add to this that any time that you've done a security assessment or penetration test, whether some of you on the call are performing them, or you may be part of an organization who had one done. Identity attack paths are inevitably part of that assessment, part of that report that gets delivered to you. They are part of that deliverable. Identity attack paths can take a number of different forms. This is actually a fairly simple version of one, right? And even the simple attack paths are not very simple. They're not always the easiest to see. And there are no, I would say, built-in tools to Active Directory to help you audit attack paths in this manner. So even this simple attack path on the screen right now is something that's extremely difficult to actually see and operationalize inside of Active Directory. And if you don't know it's there, how do you defend against it? That's really the root of the question here. Additionally, attack paths don't just live in 1 and 2, they're multiple of them in your environment for any one object. This is a nice, I would say, cluster of a map that shows that there is never just one attack path. There are many. In most of the environments that we work in, we're seeing anywhere between, I would say, 3 and 5 attack paths for any one user or computer object that can reach a tier 0 asset. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in BloodHound Enterprise and how that can actually be something that you can take control of. Because if you think about that at scale, in some of our larger environments where we're having hundreds of thousands of users and computers, the level of attack paths that we have can reach into the hundreds of thousands and millions in some cases. So this is an extremely hard problem to solve because attack paths are really hard to find. First of all, adversaries are sneaky with attack paths, and there's just so many of them. So there's a few ways that we have approached this, and some of that is really core to why we built BloodHound Enterprise the way that we did. Uh, we do that using attack path management, and this is really a way that we use to describe how to process attack paths, how to operationalize them. We think of this as a continuous form of discovery, mapping, and assessment of attack paths, but not every single one of those hundreds of thousands of attack paths need action. We, in fact, want to find the areas where you can have the largest impact while making the fewest changes, and we refer to those as choke points, which is something that will be displayed when we do the demo in just a moment here. This is just a quick, fun little graphic to show. We're not really focusing on the bottom of this slide, right? Those are the individual attack paths. Where we want to focus is where we can have the biggest amount of impact while reducing the most amount of risk with the fewest changes. Those are going to be those choke points that you see up near the top of this with that crown, of course, referencing the crown jewels or the tier 0 control plane of our environments. Attack path management has a number of benefits. The process is something where we're proactively looking and continuously scanning and looking and collecting and analyzing the data. At its core, BloodHound Enterprise is a tool that helps you audit and understand and visualize your Active Directory and Azure environments. We also include in BloodHound Enterprise the ability to look at recommendations for how do I actually fix this? What does this remediation look like? And be able to measure that, look at that reporting and trending through that. And so that is just kind of my intro through slides here. Nobody came here to look at slides. So with that, let's move into the demo portion of this, and I'll switch my screen share here into BloodHound. And I'm going to come back to this screen in just a moment here. This is where we'll spend, I would say, the bulk of the time today is exploring everything that's happening on this screen. And there's quite a bit in BloodHound Enterprise on this screen. But I actually want to start on our Explore page here. And for those of you who are familiar with the community edition of BloodHound, BloodHound BHCE, this page will be fairly familiar to you. And I want to talk about a workflow that you would commonly see in BloodHound CE and the resolution for that and why we've built a different approach for BloodHound Enterprise. And in this case, I'm going to do our pathfinding here, and I've already got data loaded up into the system. We'll talk about how that data gets collected as well later on. But in this case, I want to start somewhere. Let's say I've compromised a machine. I've compromised Alice's laptop here, and I can explore this laptop. I can look at all of the various object information, attributes, and properties, any sessions on that machine, any of the inbound and outbound control of that. But let's say I actually want to do something with this, and I've compromised this machine, and I want to know what is my route to domain admins. Paint me a picture. Okay. All right. Our picture in this case is pretty short, pretty simple. And what we're saying with this is that this is a really, I would say, simple attack path in that there is an administrator account that has a session on this laptop and has left credentials there. That allows us to pivot from the laptop to the administrator account, which itself is a tier 0 account denoted by the gem icon. And that administrator is a member of domain admins, which allows me access to that. So what if I wanted to fix this? What if I wanted to resolve this very simple attack path? Well, prior to BloodHound Enterprise, I might take this and I'd send it over to the identity team and I'd say, hey, here's your attack path. Go fix this. This is bad. And they might say, well, that's really simple. We'll just eliminate this one session here from that administrator account on that laptop. And I can't obviously go in there and change the data live for this demo, but I can pretend that we're going to do that and simulate that by eliminating this has session edge here. So I'm going to filter that out. And what that will do is it will actually allow us to visualize this in a world where that session doesn't exist. And instead of that attack path completely disappearing, like we might expect, there's actually another one. There's another attack path from Alice's laptop all the way to domain admins. And in this case, we're actually using a Active Directory certificate services escalation path that gets us through the domain head, which itself would be enough, but we'll just play with that for the sake of the demo today. And so instead of eliminating the attack path, right, I did, and there's another one. So, all right, now what do I do here? Well, I'm going to look at this ADCS attack path. In this case, it's a ESC3. And let's say I want to resolve that, and I put that through the process. I send it over to the team. They go through, they eliminate ADCS ESC3 as an attack path. And there's another one. So my point here in showing this is that looking at attack paths at such a low level and applying them from a single point of view of I'm going to resolve this one link here and there. It's not something that scales, and objects tend to have multiple attack paths. That's not something that we built the CE version of BloodHound to address. And so in this case, there's yet another attack path, and I could keep going on this for a while. Now I'm going to add back in our filters here so I don't throw myself off when I go back into here later. But just note that that path would continue happening for quite a while. So removing that one attack path is good, it's okay, but it doesn't necessarily remove the most risk or address issues at scale. And that's where we've started to take a different approach in BloodHound Enterprise. And that's what you're looking at here. So within BloodHound Enterprise, we start to approach this from the concept of tier 0. What is tier 0? Well, tier 0 is going to represent the control plane of your environment. And in an on-prem AD, that's going to be the typical things like domain controllers. It's going to be domain admins, enterprise admins, all of the groups that you see here, all of those DCs, those are going to be that concept of a default tier 0. So anything in there, we will find and map attack paths for. Now, a lot of our customers have additional services, users, servers that represent control plane users or groups or applications. Very commonly, we might see something like a privileged access management tool, like a CyberArk or SailPoint, or a sync server that's used for like an Okta directory sync. And we want to add those into tier 0. So you have the ability, of course, to modify tier 0, add and remove as you see fit. This is a prioritization and categorization process that we do help you with here at SpectreOps. So that is part of the process that we put you through is really a categorization of what is tier 0 for you. Not every customer will have the same environment when it comes to tier 0. And it is important that we identify tier 0 because all of our attack path mapping is based on that. So from here, we're going to analyze every single attack path to tier 0 on a recurring basis. And if you've used the CE version of BloodHound, you know that it is a very manual process to run the collection, gather the files, upload them to BloodHound server, and it's a very one-off manual process. The collection and the analysis is happening on a recurring scheduled basis here, so there is no running a collection and uploading a file. All of that's happening behind the scenes. You can, of course, still do a one-off file ingestion, but for the most part, we see scheduled scans happening. And what you're looking at on the screen is tier 0 at the top. And then each one of these paths represent one of those choke points that I had referred to earlier. And for each one of these choke points, we can expand this out. And in our very small demo environment, I think we have like 75 or 100 users in here. You can see that even this can be somewhat complex if we were to try and look at that. But we want to focus on the choke points, the paths at the top here. And in this case, right, how do we prioritize this when we might have an environment with thousands, hundreds of thousands of attack paths? Well, on the right-hand side here, you'll see various attack paths and findings. You'll also see a notation of critical, high, and low. Now, I want to be clear, these aren't necessarily saying this is a critical vulnerability. You should look at this. This is a 10 out of 10 CVSS score. But instead, all of these are important. All of these are critical in the aspect of you should look at these, you should address these. They all represent a path to tier 0. But when we look at this and we say this is critical, what we are referring to is the exposure in your environment to this attack path. And so if I open up our timeline here and I look at the exposure over time, I can see that at this point in time, we have roughly 98% of our environment that is able to be exposed to this attack path, which means essentially anybody within authenticated users here is vulnerable to this attack path. So I can land on 98% of our principals or our users and objects in this environment and leverage this attack path. So when we look at critical, high, and low, we are looking at that from the concept of exposure and how much of the environment is vulnerable to that. This is a objective way of prioritizing this. It's not us saying we think this is more important. It is a objective measure of this is how much of your environment is actually vulnerable to this. So resolving it in this manner, looking at the exposure allows you to make the fewest changes while reducing the most risk. It is one of the better ways, I would say, to resolve attack paths is by looking at that exposure level. And with this, how do you fix this, right? How do you fix when you have so many attack paths? How do you, where do you even start? There's varying levels of complexity to these attack paths. And something like logons from tier 0 users is probably one of the simpler ones to show. We have a number of tier 0 users. Think of these as just largely speaking, let's say domain admins. You don't want domain admins logging into regular laptops and servers just daily. You want them logging into other tier 0 assets. You don't want them leaving credentials around where they could otherwise be in plain text, in memory, brought down with mimikatz. It's not something you want. So how do we resolve this? Well, I had mentioned earlier that we include recommendations for remediation. So every attack path will include how do I fix this? And in this case, our recommendation is perhaps a GPO to restrict tier 0 logons. And we guide you through this, along with telling you, once again, all the principles, tier 0 users who are involved in this, but also reference documentation on the right-hand side for how is this actually abused, what are some interesting mappings or blogs or websites that we can lead you to learn more about this attack path. Of course, hey, domain admins logging into regular laptops is not a very interesting attack path. It's a very common one, but not super interesting. But in this case, I might know what to do. I might be able to do this. That's not a problem. I can send that off to the right team and have them take care of that. In a lot of cases, though, we need to take a little bit more care into the resolution, and we need to understand how do we actually operationalize the remediation here. And in a case like an ADCS escalation path, the documentation for this is very well thought through, but ADCS is complicated. It's convoluted. There's a lot to it, and it touches a lot. So documentation like this, you'll want to put through a similar path as you might something like vulnerability management. And we really think of the attack paths in BloodHound as really just another feed for a vuln management program. While they're not necessarily a vulnerability in the sense that you should patch this server because the database is out of date and has an exploit, they still represent a vulnerability in the environment. And we found that the customers who have taken the most care and gotten the most out of the product, they are operationalizing this in a manner similar to threat vulnerability management programs. Changes can't always be made simply, and in many cases, they'll just require vetting and planning. You'll want to evaluate the risk of a change. You'll want to propose the change. You'll want to ideally test it in most cases. changes will occur and you can validate that they worked, or you might choose to say, hey, this is an expected behavior. We've reduced it to the amount we can, and we want to accept that risk. So in this case, right, I had a customer that I talked to a few weeks ago who had an ADCS escalation path, and it was something that was driven by their MDM in the environment, which was, of course, using certificates. And so while they were able to reduce the exposure from nearly 100% of their environment, they weren't able to reduce it completely. And that was an acceptable risk to them. They had other mitigating factors. And in cases like that, we can choose to accept these as a risk and mute them for X amount of time and say, I know that this exists. I'm acknowledging it. Don't show me again. I don't need to see this. So you have that ability to mute these or accept them, whatever terminology you might choose to use there. In some cases, when we are resolving these attack paths, we also might need to make those changes to tier 0. So in a case like a DC sync attack path, I have two principals here. I have a domain user and a DC syncers group. Now, I might look at this and I say, okay, well, why does domain user have that privilege, that permission? I should go in and I should look at this. But DC syncers, like this is something that should be able to perform a DC sync. That is expected. It needs those permissions inside of that group. And this is where we can go into here and we can say, hey, I expect this. This is normal. I want to add this to tier 0, right? And that becomes just another part of that tier 0 node. And then we'll start to actually look for attack paths to DC syncers because this is now tier 0 and it represents part of that control plane. So while I'm here, right, I just want to add, if we look at any one of the edges, which is what you see in the middle here, an edge describes a relationship between nodes. The nodes are on the left and right hand side in this case. Any of the edges will provide information in the right hand side here around what we're actually saying, what this is, and how you can abuse this in both the Windows and Linux environments, depending on what you're looking at here. So there's a lot of different references and learning materials. So if you have admins or identity teams in here who say, listen, like this is, this attack is new to me. I'm not familiar with this. I'm not a red teamer. I'm not a pen tester. I don't understand this. Well, we want this to be a learning tool as well. We understand that not everybody will understand every single attack vector, attack path that we are showing. And so that's why we include the remediation documentation as thoroughly as we do, as well as some of the educational material around how is this actually used and what does that actually look like. Now, of course, I can always look into here and say, well, I want to know more about individual user groups, who's a member of what members are inside of these, so on and so forth. I have a lot of ability to explore that. Now, as we start to resolve some of these attack paths, we want to be able to report on that. We want to be able to look at that posture over time. And that's where we've built in some reporting and posture management into the product itself. This is something that's also going to be new from BloodHound Community Edition. Now, our demo environment here is fairly new, so you don't see a lot of hills and valleys in these graphs necessarily. And if we did fix everything in here, I wouldn't have anything to demo you. So that's why you don't see necessarily a big drop here, but we want to look at that attack path exposure over time. And I would say that for most of our customers, they start out between 70 and 100% exposed in their environment for attack paths. We have seen measurable reduction on that in the form of 30, 40% reduction in attack path exposure in the first month to two of working with BloodHound Enterprise. So it's absolutely possible and very realistic to reduce your exposure by a measurable amount in a very reasonable amount of time. We also want to measure the amount of tier 0 principals that we see in the product over time. I wouldn't say it's exactly super common, but it does happen somewhat often that we see a large, perhaps default group added into domain admins on accident or for testing purposes. The team here at SpectreOps knows I'm a big fan of the saying that the most permanent change in Active Directory is the one that you applied for 5 minutes for testing. And I think there's probably a few people in the audience right now who can resonate with that. I know as somebody who had AD admin privileges myself, it was definitely a lot easier for me to over-apply permissions at times and see if something worked than it was to actually find the very specific niche reason that it wasn't working. So might be relatable, don't recommend it, but still something we see. We're also looking at individual attack paths over time and looking at how these have changed. looking at the severity of them actively, and just a general idea of what is in scope for this environment, what are we looking at. Everything that we've talked about today is also true for Azure. So we haven't gone into detail on Azure, but just note that we do support Azure environments. This isn't something that is very different from what I've discussed. All of the attack path management, all of the remediation, all of the prioritization is exactly the same for Azure. We're just talking about different nodes. We're talking about different relationships. We're looking at applications and roles, differences in Azure fundamentally. It has simplified a lot of the directory services, but there has also been a lot added into Azure when it comes to different attack paths. From an architecture standpoint, BloodHound Enterprise is a hosted solution, so it is a SaaS product hosted in our AWS environment. So this isn't something that you're going to be running on a laptop or a lethargic server somewhere. We hear a lot of the time, hey, I've got a big environment, I'm running BloodHound CE, and it just takes forever to draw the maps. It takes forever to do this thing. I can't add multiple people on the server at once because it dies on me. So that becomes much less of an issue when it is a hosted product and a SaaS product like BloodHound Enterprise. And the collectors themselves are essentially managed from our management panel. You can have multiple collectors. You can have collectors for Azure and for individual on-prem AD environments. Now, if you have a trust between domains, one collector might gather from many domains. If you have very segregated networks and domains, you can always deploy collectors individually as well. So you can really get as granular as you'd want here. The collectors reach out to our service and they send us data on a recurring basis. In this case, you can see the data that we are collecting, and we've set that schedule for every 4 hours. Most of our customers, I would say, are gathering data every 4 to 6 hours. And what that does is it means that anytime you go into here and you look at attack paths for Azure or for AD, the data is always fresh. It's always analyzing. You don't have to go and run a manual scan unless you want to. You still have that option. And that can be good for making changes and validating changes and having that recurring process over time. But having everything centrally managed in the BloodHound Enterprise management panel, having a hosted product instead of running it on a laptop, it means there's no Docker container to maintain, to pull down for updates. It's upgraded for you automatically, so you get always the newest, latest features, and you have scale and performance enhancements that are just built into the product, being that it is now a hosted product. So with that, those are some of the key points that I wanted to cover today. I hope that you leave today understanding a little bit more about the problems that we are solving with BloodHound Enterprise and how it functions, some of the features and functionality. If you don't leave today with that, well, you can keep that feedback here and not tell my manager. That would be great. But I think at this point, we'll just open it up to a Q&A. I don't know, Sergio or Stephen, if there's been anything we want to highlight in the chat or anything that's come through, just let me know.
Nothing yet.
All right. And it does look like there's just other question about will the webinar be recorded? It is recorded. Will it be on our YouTube channel? I'm not sure if it'll be on YouTube. Sounds like it'll be on YouTube after that, according to the answer. We'll also send this out, so don't worry about having to remember every single thing I've said. But we will just pause for just a moment here if there are any questions we want to highlight.
Jacob, we got a question on BloodHound Enterprise and if it gets down to specific file level permissions. Can you elaborate on that?
Got it. Yeah. So we're not necessarily doing what's the category for data security posture management necessarily. So we're not going to be looking at like OneDrive file permissions or file server permissions. It's really looking at the AD permissions when it comes to structure and relationships between the objects, the GPOs, the groups, the computers, and users. So not necessarily looking at file level permissions in that regard. I see there's also a couple other questions here. Do we provide an API? Yes, we do. We have a really robust API. I would say that nearly everything that I've shown you today actually is done through an API. So it's a great question. Actually, something I did want to touch on is that when it comes to reporting and dashboarding, we also have pre-built apps for Splunk and Microsoft Sentinel, SIMS. A lot of our customers have built integrations using the REST APIs as well for other alerting detection means, other integrations that might be specific to their workflows. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
And Vince asked kind of a follow-up to that if Bloodhound could be integrated with other dashboards, so it kind of falls in line with the, you know, feeding into SIMs, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the APIs we have are really robust. I'd say that they're some of the most well documented and thorough APIs. Everything from authentication to pulling down attack paths and individual attack path data. So yes, it can be integrated. Today we have the built-in apps for Sentinel and Splunk. However, you can pull the data down however you wish and integrate it however you might want in that manner. Uh, I'm just looking at these as they come in. Is the data real time or just a point in time scheduled scan? If so, do customers typically run multiple a day or once daily? So the scans happen at intervals at your choosing. So if I'm going to uh, have a collector here, I can set the schedule for this for whatever data I might want to collect. And so I would say most of our customers are doing this every 4 to 6 hours. And so their data uh, is fresh every 4 to 6 hours. It is looking at what does that look like at that point in time, but because you can have this at a recurring basis, it is much more flexible, much more useful than the just I'm running a scan with Bloodhound Community Edition and uploading a single file, and it's just going to be stale after today. All right, Sergio, what else do we have?
We have a question about exporting data into CSV formats from Bloodhound Enterprise.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways to export data. If I take something like this ADCS attack path here, I can always export information here to CSV. I can also look at the Explore page and say I want to export, and here it is a JSON export. However, we do have, I believe somebody on our Bloodhound Enterprise team has created a JSON to CSV export script as well. So a conversion script there. So you can get the data out. You can also pull it down in a CSV format from the REST APIs if you'd want something a little bit more programmatic instead of just point in time.
Yeah, and to elaborate a little further, um, the only thing that we're exporting out of Bloodhound Enterprise are the findings themselves. So it's not like you can export the LDAP data from AD via Bloodhound Enterprise. You use another tool for that.
Yep. Um, There's a question on the pricing model. I was waiting for that one. So we do price based on full-time employees for an organization. It's dependent on organization size. So uh, while I have the title of sales engineer, I am not a salesperson. So I would definitely recommend if you want, individual organization pricing, just to send us a follow-up. We're going to drop a email in the chat if we haven't already. It's trial@spectrops.io if you'd like to contact us for an individual demo or any more information. It looks like Stephen is ahead of me on that, so just look at the chat and you'll see the email. Do you think at some point the solution will go beyond AD for APM? That's a really interesting question. Stephen, I don't know if you want to address that. Stephen is on our product team, and I think you might have a little bit more of a nuanced answer to that than I could. I could give an answer. I don't know if you'd like my answer.
I'm happy to answer. So right now we do go beyond Active Directory. We have coverage for Azure as well. Within Azure, we cover 3 different identity providers as well. So that's not just 2 things, it's actually technically 4 things if you want to be pedantic. So within Azure, we cover Azure AD, or now called Entra ID. We cover Azure RM, which is more like an AWS or an IaaS competitor. Um, and then we also cover Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is an overlay solution that has its own permission model as well, that can give you the ability to execute attacks within the platform. So right now, those are the two areas of coverage that we have.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, of course.
Another question on any future plans to collect open ports and IP data. I'll go ahead and take that. At the moment, right, with there's a bunch of other tools that are already collecting that kind of data for Spectre Ops and attack path management. We're really focusing on the relationships and the attack paths there, not so much the IPs and open ports. Maybe someday, but that's really kind of out of scope for what it is we're looking at.
Yep, absolutely. Do you need a dedicated domain admin account tied to BHE to get the scheduled scan results? So our recommendation for the collection for on-prem AD is to use a GMSA, so a group managed service account, that can reach out to the various machines and get session data, local authentication data. It does not explicitly need to be a domain admin. I want to make that very clear, right? It does not need to be a domain admin account. So we do recommend a GMSA, and we have various hardening recommendations for that account. But yes, that is it does not need to be a domain admin. And then I believe Nick is referencing the areas of coverage described for Azure. Is that included in BloodHound Enterprise? Yes. So that would be included in BloodHound Enterprise. Those 3 areas of Azure. Those are done through our Azure Hound collector, which, yeah, absolutely.
All the questions for now.
Yeah, looks like we've exhausted the list of Q&A. Some really good questions in there. Appreciate all the questions. I think we learned a little bit about how we might modify this webinar for the next one, so we can answer some of those questions in advance. Definitely appreciate the input and interactivity here. I think if there's no more questions, we'll probably be good to wrap up. Just wanted to thank everybody again for joining. I know it's morning for some, afternoon for some, and evening for some, I'm sure. So thank you again for coming to our demo of BloodHound Enterprise. I hope that this has been beneficial for you. We definitely appreciate having you here. And I think with that, we will wrap it up. If you have any other questions or would like to talk more in detail, please feel free to reach out on the trial at email address there. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.